Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our panel, Developing and Implementing Interpretive Plans, How to Tell the Stories of the Delta and Carquinez Strait. Now you may be wondering, what is interpretation in the first place? It's defined as a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and meanings inherent in the resource. And you may be thinking, that sounds like it was written by a committee. Maybe I can boil it down to communicating the cool stuff about a place. Interpreters work to provoke, relate, and reveal. And an interpretive plan then is a somewhat detailed document that serves as a roadmap for producing signs, programs, or events that help convey information to the public. I'd like to introduce the panelists to you, all with quite a bit of experience in interpretation. Kathy Schultz, currently manager of the Water Education Program for the California Department of Water Resources. Prior to working with DWR, she spent 10 years as an interpretive writer and planner with California State Parks. She's a certified interpretive planner with the National Association for Interpretation and has a master's in natural resources and environment from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She lives in Sacramento with her son, 2 cats, a leopard gecko, and too many guppies to count. Delta Mello has worked in the nonprofit field for over 25 years. She is the executive director, CEO of the Sacramento History Alliance, which manages the Sacramento History Museum, underground tours, Sacramento Visitor Center, and the Sacramento Living History in Old Sacramento. The Alliance also supports the Center for Sacramento History, which holds the city's rich historic artifacts, documents, and photographs. Prior to that, she was the executive director of the California Automobile Museum and formerly the development director for the California State Railroad Museum Foundation. In her spare time, she's a professional storyteller and historical reenactor. And strangely enough, she mentioned that she also has a leopard gecko. My name is David Price. I've been a graphic designer and art director for over 35 years, and have been designing interpretive exhibits and panels for 19 years through my business, David Price Design. I've worked as a contractor with California State Parks and other entities on interpretive exhibits and panels across the strait, and I have no geckos of any kind. First, we'll have Kathy talk about interpretive planning. Kathy said in an email that I could talk for hours about interpretive planning, but we're giving her 15 minutes. Then Delta and I will speak, and then we'll take any questions.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all, and thank you, Blake, for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to be talking about this. I want to just reiterate what David said about interpretation, that it's a form of communication, and it's a form of communication that should hit both the heart and the mind, both the intellect and the emotional aspects of people's life. And the key thing about interpretation is it helps people understand the significance of a place, what really makes it special. A lot of times people will conflate interpretation and education, and they're different. They're very different things. I'm overseeing an education program right now, and quite honestly, education is not quite as much fun as interpretation. Education is about testing or absorbing knowledge or skill and learning skills. In education, people will pay attention, you hope they'll pay attention, because there may be a test or some other demonstration of learning that comes later. In interpretation, in interpretive experiences, the visitor has full autonomy. The visitor is king or queen, and they can and will walk out on your program or away from your exhibits or your center if they're not interested. And in planning for interpretation, you can do some things that will make sure that what you are providing to the visitors will draw them in and help them see what makes the place that you care about so special, and help them understand that as well. So there's a lot to an interpretive plan, but I'm just going to go over some of the highlights today. There's a couple of key things you want to do in your interpretive plan. And the first is you want to establish your key messages. You want to know what it is you're going to communicate to people, what you want them to understand. You also want to identify the goals and objectives for interpretation, what you hope to accomplish. And this can be things like building a sense of place for residents in an area, helping visitors to an area understand what's so important. You can do resource protection through interpretation, but really identifying what are your key goals, what are your objectives, and lastly, how are you going to get there? And that's identifying your programs and your products. Interpretation can be live, it can be a speaker, it can be somebody doing a program. Interpretation can also be done through panels like David designs, through brochures, through exhibits, through audio programs. There are so many varieties of interpretive media, and you'll want to do a mix of them. And where you do it, how you do it, is going to be something that you will determine through the planning process. And it's not just a plan that you're going to do, it is an entire process. And that process is just as important, if not more so, than the plan. Because that's where you're really going to look hard at your area, look hard at your stories, figure out what you want to do, build relationships with everybody else who has an investment in this area, and come up with your end products. It can be really hard, especially in an area like the Delta, to figure out what are those messages, what do you want to do. This is an incredibly vast region, an incredibly diverse region, and there are a lot of stories to tell. And your plan is going to help you prioritize what you want to do. And one way that interpreters do this is by looking at 3 different parts of the system or the area. The first is, what is your resource? It's the Delta. There is a lot to the Delta. There's a lot you can share about it. You really shouldn't have too much difficulty finding the stories. The hard part's going to be narrowing them down. And it seems sort of self-evident that you would want to talk about the Delta in the Delta, but sometimes people have passions that maybe they want to share and aren't necessarily relevant to that area. Before I came to California State Parks, I worked for Oregon State Parks, and when I started there, my manager was very firm that he wanted good, place-based, relevant, interpretive programs, and we were not going to be showing a video on castles of the Rhine in our campgrounds anymore. So, your resource, what do you have? What do you have here? It's the Delta, and going from there. You're not going to talk about Lake Tahoe in the Delta, no matter how many people come to California to see Lake Tahoe. The second piece you want to look at is management. What are the critical issues, for example, in terms of resource protection? Interpretation can help reduce inadvertent damage by letting people know why things are important and what steps they can do to help. A lot of people who come into areas, a lot of visitors to parks and other natural areas, historic sites, they're not really thinking about the impact that they might have on the resources. It might look great to climb up on a historic statue with your whole family, to take a photo, to have a great memory. But through interpretation, you can let people know why these resources are sensitive, why they're valuable, why it's important to give them some space and treat them gently. So interpretation, you're looking at what are your management issues, what do you want to accomplish here? And then the last piece is, who is your audience? Again, who are the people who are coming here? What are they interested in? And where those 3 overlap, I love Venn diagrams, where those 3 overlap, that tiny area there, that's what you mostly want to focus on. So you're not going to get all your stories in there. You're not going to be able to address all your management issues through interpretation. You're not going to be able to talk about all the things that people are interested in. There's too much to do, and you want to be focusing where you get the biggest bang for your buck. Now, that's not to say that you won't have some stories that maybe hit 2 areas. There could be a really important resource issue that you want people to know about, and they just don't know that they're interested in it yet. And so you can share that with them. Or there might be something that people are really, really interested about, and it's not a huge resource protection issue, it's not a priority for management, but it's why people are coming here. So you want to meet them where they are, where they're coming for. But again, most of your stories, and that's what the planning process will do, is help you identify where those 3 pieces overlap. So just a couple of best practices of interpretive planning. The first is you want to incorporate the input of as many key stakeholders as possible. And this is really essential. You want to reach out to people who have an interest, a relationship with the Delta, and that's going to make this a really big process. And my recommendation to Blake is you find a really, really good interpretive planner. You bring on a team of people. You want a skilled facilitator. You want somebody who has design skills. You want, if somebody comes to you and says, I can do this as a one-person job, they don't know what they're getting in for. Because you're going to want to be holding stakeholder meetings, facilitated stakeholder meetings. You may want to do interviews with people. You might want to do surveys. You're going to want to get as much input as you can to help guide the products that you produce. And there's 15 Native American tribes with traditional ties to the Delta. You're going to want to reach out to them. You've got agriculture. You've got fisheries. You've got historic communities like Locke just up the road. You've got your recreational users, your environmental groups, the different management agencies. State Parks is in the Delta, DWR, CDFW, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service. You're going to want to be getting input from all of these stakeholders. The thing about interpretive planning is it's going to bring together people who may not always get along. We know that there are a lot of differing opinions about the Delta. On how the Delta should be used, on how the Delta should be managed, on what are the priorities in the Delta, and you want everybody to be able to come together and share their stories. Interpretation can work through some of those issues and even create shared understanding. When I worked with state parks, sometimes we had meetings where people refused to be in the same room together. We had another meeting where we had people in the room together for the first time in 20 years. So it's a really good opportunity to start building dialogue and encourage people to talk to each other and find out what all the stories are and the priorities are. That said, don't rush the process. This is like I said, this is a huge area. This isn't like planning for a single visitor center or a single park. You're looking at a large region. Best case scenario, you're looking at least 18 to 24 months. And I think you have a timeline that you have to complete this in under the National Heritage Area rules. But definitely don't rush the process. Again, you're going to want to hire somebody who knows what they're doing, who's got a solid background in interpretive planning, who's going to come in, who's going to do the research, who's going to learn about the area, who's going to talk to the stakeholders, learn from people, learn from the documents that already exist. And you want to have a good solid plan. It's like building the foundation for your house. You don't want to go fast on the foundation and slap something up. You want to have that foundation as solid as possible. One of the other things you want to look at is there's already a lot of interpretation being done here in the Delta. There's the Locke Boarding House Museum. East Bay Regional Parks District has Big Break Regional Shoreline. The Cosumnes River Preserve Visitor Center is out there. There's the Hagen Museum, the Rio Vista Museum, the Delta Science Center. So there's a lot of interpretation already being done here. And so you'll want to reach out, look at what's being done here already, and then you'll want to do a gap analysis. What's missing? What can this plan help you do more of that's not already being done? You want to look at the existing documents that are there. There was a Delta Sign Plan. Was anybody in this room involved with the Delta Sign Plan development? Yeah, so the Delta Sign Plan was recently done, and that it looks like it may have been a similar process with stakeholder meetings where people came in and gave their input, and then the designer came back and shared some ideas and came up with the kind of what the concept designs would be. It's the same sort of process you're going to want to do for an interpretive plan. And you can look at that plan. The state park general plans, they're old. They don't have a lot on interpretation in there, but they do have some, and they've got a lot of really good background information. You can look at these. There's one for Benicia State Recreation Area and also for Brandon Island. So going through this, taking time, again, the process is as important in the plan as the plan. You can be building relationships, you can be finding partners. Interpretation is not necessarily cheap to do, so more collaboration that you can do together. A lot of agencies that give out grants for interpretive products like seeing public-private partnerships, so this is a great time to start, finding people that you can work with together. Lastly, you've spent all this time, at least 18 to 24 months, lots of meetings, you've got a core team reviewing everything. You don't want your plan to just sit on the shelf. So you need to plan for implementation. You'll want to have somebody who is the lead, who is designated to see it through. I suspect that you will probably have multiple organizations or groups or agencies doing different parts of the interpretive plan, but you really wanted to have some sort of lead person or lead committee that will continue to meet and make sure that the plan is actually implemented and all the great ideas that everybody came up with come to fruition. There are some great resources available to help you as you move through the interpretive planning process. The first one is specifically for heritage areas. It's put together by the National Park Service. I looked through it. It is both comprehensive and comprehensible. I would start there. It's a great resource. National Association for Interpretation is the leading professional organization for interpreters in the United States. NAI offers a certified interpretive planner course. They have some books on interpretation. It's a really good resource, and NAI in general is a really good resource. There is a regional Northern California NAI group that has its conference every May. Some of you might want to attend that next year just to get a firmer grounding in interpretation if this is a new field to you. California State Parks has a guide to interpretive planning as well. This was developed about 5 years ago. It's more general interpretive plans, but it can also be a resource. There's no one way to do interpretive plans. All interpretive plans have some key components to them. They identify messages, the goals and objectives, they have a good background information section, but you can structure them a little differently, and so the State Parks one is another resource. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is California State Parks All Visitors Welcome. This is the State Parks Guide to Accessibility. And it is, along with the Smithsonian Institute's Guide to Accessibility, those are the two top guides for accessibility and interpretation in the country. And I just want to encourage you to keep this in mind, that you want to have your interpretation to be accessible. One, it helps you avoid lawsuits. But two, it's an issue of access and justice, and they have a lot of information on there just on some very basic principles in terms of design, placement, font size, that can help just make all the products you're going to work so hard on accessible to the greatest number of people. So with that, I'm going to pass on to David, and I think we'll have time for some questions at the end.
Yeah, and I'll give it right over to Delta.
Okay.
Thank you. While we're changing over, I thought I would clarify because it was confusing apparently when my name tag was made of my name, Delta Carquinez Mello, and it was thought, as often happens to me, that I was a company and not a person. So I'll tell you the story of my name. I am not from this area. I was born in the Bay Area. My mother came from Minnesota. Her name was Delta, and her aunt's name was Delta. So it was a family name that was passed on to me, and of course works out really well for this region. Pig is my middle name, or is my maiden name, excuse me. I married a Portuguese man. His family's from the Azores, and therefore the Mello, which is rampant throughout the Delta region and the Portuguese community. So that is the compilation of my name and how I came to be with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of a case study, all the things that can go wrong with what Kathy just told you, and just when you're dealing with a hot mess. And that hot mess is Old Sacramento. How many of you have been to Old Sacramento before? Very good, okay. So, quick real history on Old Sacramento. It was where the gateway to the gold rush. It is where the commerce, it's where the people that got rich selling items to the miners, all of the ships and the people came through Sacramento to get through their supplies before going into the gold fields. And so it was a city that should never have been. It was built on a swampland. The Native Americans knew that. The people that wanted to build their city there did not listen. It was flooded. It burnt down. It was flooded. It burnt down. They had, somewhere in between, they had an epidemic of cholera. This was not a place that was supposed to exist, but they insisted on creating this place. What happened was, to keep from flooding, they raised the streets of the city. And they raised them 10 feet up. Some buildings were literally jacked up with jacks, corner to corner, and jacking up the whole building. And some were just, they took the second floor and made it the first floor. They also built the levee system, and that was given, the land was given to the railroad to do that. The railroad built the levee system, and the railroad had their terminus. So Old Sacramento is rife with history. Through the years, it was this historical place that became one of the worst slums this side of the Mississippi. That was a community, but it still was a really not good place. And in the 60s, they decided they wanted to redevelop it, restore it, bring it back into this historical place that it was. And in doing so, it was designated as a National Historic Landmark District. But it was done before there was the registry. And David, if there's anything I say that's wrong, please correct me. So before there was a registry, it's like being a landmark status without the rules yet. So they didn't have the rules, and consequently some decisions were made. And so now we're up to today. This is Old Sacramento with some of the historic buildings. The historic buildings are from the 1870s, 1880s. This is some of the interpretation that my organization manages. So we have the museum there. We have the underground tours talking about the lifting of the cities. And we have the visitor center. So we have kind of a hodgepodge of things. But what is our challenge? Our challenge is that Old Sacramento is made up of a state park, the Old Sacramento State Historic Park, which has the Railroad Museum in it. It has our museum, which is nicely tucked into the state park, oddly so. And then it has the rest of the community, that is those historic buildings, that are owned by private citizens. So we have this battle constantly of how we're going to interpret and manage and what stories we're going to tell, because, as Kathy said, there are so many stories. All those buildings, 1870s and 80s. Yet our museum, we talk about the 1850s. The Railroad Museum, 1860s. Then you have the Pony Express that came there. I mean, you have so many wonderful stories to tell. How do you pick what to tell? Again, you have these stakeholders. You have state parks who wants to have their interpretive plan. You have the city who has designated what the signage should be for the area, and they've decided, again, in somewhat of a vacuum. So today I just got a text because I'm fairly new and I screwed up and I put up the wrong kind of sign on my building for the underground tours, so I'm going to have to fix that. But everybody is operating under their own rules. Plus, the area was purchased, those buildings were purchased by people who saw Old Sacramento as being a place for tourism, and so there's a lot of private owners in there as well. We have struggled for years and years and years of how to interpret this place that is not only a National Historic Landmark District, it's also a very populated tourism place. So now we have the Convention and Visitors Bureau who wants to wants us to make it more tourism happy. What more can we do down there? How can we get more people down there? How can we get people to stay in Sacramento for another night? And this is the battle that we have gone through over and over and over and over again. State Parks would come up with a plan, and they've decided that they would do everything in the district and they would kind of manage it. City of Sacramento says, no, 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 you're not going to manage us. We make the rules. We own our area. And then the merchants and the business owners say, why? We can't sell. We can't sell things. We can't get customers. We can't. So this battle went on and on and on. We are today, this is Old Sacramento. It's kind of a map view of it. Let's see if I can find us. So we're there. We're nestled in this state park, really in this corner. So as a museum, we have our own issues. We have all of these private businesses in addition. We have the railroad that comes through there, and we have the waterfront. So those of you that have been around Sacramento and have been listening lately, we have rebranded to be the Old Sacramento Waterfront. Now, this was again done in somewhat of a vacuum. It was considered the fact that people want to see the river and want to see a waterfront. So now we have another competing interpretive issue where we're now calling it not Old Sacramento, but Old Sacramento Waterfront. What has happened recently is actually some really good news. What has happened recently is that this area is being designated to receive money, TOT money, to do some things to attract more tourists to it. As we, the Historical Society, who are included in this project, we are going to be the ones to make sure that the historical aspect is not overridden by this desire to bring more tourists in there. So we are kind of the police, or the history police in a way. What Kathy alluded to, what she said was building relationships. And I had to write that down because as the process started, the good thing that happened was that each of the stakeholders were brought to meetings to talk about what works in Old Sacramento. And we were brought in individually. And so the historical people were brought in. What works? What do you want? You know, we want to preserve our history here. We don't want to lose some of these important buildings and historic stories that we can tell. We don't want to lose the place for them. The merchants and the business owners were brought in. They don't want so many rules. They want to be able to market, to sell their wares, to do their business in this place, and they want to see the history happen more. Then you have the state parks. What do they want to do? Well, state parks wants to do what state parks does, and that is simply operate in their state park rules. So these three entities were brought together as stakeholders, but not brought together. They were talked to individually. The good news out of that, and what I would say, that when you have a district that has so many different entities and so many different stakeholders, is, as Kathy said, bringing them together and talking to them and getting their input. But what happens when they don't agree? You've got all this input, but it doesn't agree. And what they are establishing now, and this is the one thing that I have seen that we don't hear about really in the news when we hear about Old Sacramento Waterfront and what's going on, is that they have created a board, a higher level, a board or commission, I'm not sure how they're going to call it, that includes representatives from state parks, from the city, and from the business owners, which seems obvious, but what they have done is they have done this on a much higher level. So those of us who are in the trenches that are working day to day, we are important, but to have the people on the higher level agree to some basic things will filter down. And it is what has happened over the years, I believe, is that us on the ground have been trying to make things work together and trying over and over and over and over for years. It takes that higher level. So getting some of the people that are truly influential, that may not even walk down the streets of your area, but they're truly influential, getting them to agree on some basic things, that is going to filter down. And that's the aspect that's being worked on right now. So we have a rebirth in the area. We're going to have to revisit how we're branding. There's interpretation, and then there's branding. That's just the marketing end of it, and we're going to continue to move forward, but this aspect of bringing that higher level together, I think, is going to be very important to the success, because there have been plans, as Kathy has said, don't let it sit on the shelf. There have been plans over and over and over again. It is an interesting thing to watch and to be aware of, and to maybe not make some of the same mistakes. Some are inherent to how Old Sacramento was created by selling off much of it to private owners. They could have made it a Williamsburg type park where it's owned by one entity, but that's not how it worked. It's a constant challenge, but I see some hope in not only being able to interpret the stories and the history, but allowing for what is reality today. People who need, the boardwalks are great, but we need ADA accessibility. We need to have the comforts of tourists and people coming to it. So all of those things need to work together, and I see some hope for the place, and that's kind of why I'm there. One of the things that I did want to say on interpretation is back to, so this is kind of an example of going from what was one concept of, look, it's old Sacramento, to, oh no, it's old, we're going to drop that one day, Sacramento waterfront. Not everybody's happy about this, and it was done without the interpretive plan process to come to this point. So hopefully we will get over that. But one thing that we do within the Sacramento History Alliance in the interpretive portion of it is through our underground tours, and we go through the same process within ourselves. We have many stories to tell. We have an historic area that has multiple layers of years and events. Which do we tell? And we do that through our underground tours, through the exhibits in the museum, and through our living history reenactors. So we look at Old Sacramento as our overall museum. It just happens that some of it is indoors, some of it's outdoors, some of it's walking around. So we will continue to be the police for the area and continue working on the things that we do in the interpretation of the historic district. Okay.
Okay, now I'll talk about some of my experience. I'm often on the receiving end. An interpretive plan on large projects. The plan is done before they hire me to design and maybe write interpretive panels or a larger exhibit. So I'll show you some examples of interpretive plans that I've received and worked with. I often receive these as part of the request for proposals that are sent to me. So these are PDFs that were sent to me, the actual interpretive plans. So this is for Milbrand, it's near Sonoma, and this is kind of typical. They go through their mission statement, their executive summary, some of their goals and visions for the project. They go into the visitation, which I find that very helpful to know who's coming to the park, education level, do we need to do a Spanish version, things like that. All of that is good to know up front. I'm just going to gloss over this, but then they go into their interpretive theme, which is really long. It's this 4-paragraph thing. But what I like on here is that it has a map, and it's mapped out what they're thinking for different areas of the park, what messages they want to convey, and that's really good information to start with when you're starting to think of what panels will we do where. And then they have some sub-themes that might apply to a single panel. And then they go into, let's see, some floor plans and rough ideas of what the visitor center might look like, just kind of their vision. Then if we go on to another plan, this is for Casa Grande. It's a plaza in downtown Sonoma that's surrounded by historic buildings from different eras. I did some interpretive panels that went in that part. They start off with the mission for the park and other missions, a lot of missions. And then they talk about their goals, and then we finally come to their interpretive theme, which is Sonoma State Historic Park preserves historic buildings and sites that tell the story of a dynamic period in California history when Sonoma served as a focal point for state and internationally significant events. And I used that idea as introductory paragraph of one of the panels and kind of paraphrased it as a surprising amount of California's history has taken place in these few blocks of Sonoma. And from that, we were using that thing, we developed some interpretive panels, and we used that theme. One of the ideas was that quite a bit of interesting historical events took place right around that plaza. So we wanted to show the kind of the arc of history that happened there. So we did one big interpretive panel right kind of at the entrance of the park, right in this plaza. This is looking from above down on this is the first layout for the panel. It talks about the Native Americans helping to build a mission in that period of time, and then later with the Spanish and Mexican eras, and then raising the first bear flag, which was the precursor to the California state flag when California became a state later. Then, after some going back and forth with the committee on it, we made some changes. One of them was that it's right on a plaza where there's buses that unload, and giant hordes of school kids come off and to tour the park. So we wanted to make the panels so that a large number of people could access it all at once. They could all go up and read different parts, but it's still kind of the same idea of the mission building period and the Spanish period and the state flag, bear flag raising. And then we made a full-size mock-up of the panel, and we brought it to the park and set it out so the public that was walking by could stop in and make comments and talk about what they liked about it, what they didn't, what piqued their interest, what was missing that they were still scratching their head about. And we incorporated some of those ideas into the panel. And I want to stress that is a really important step, is getting the public involved and asking them what is interesting to them, what they'd like to know about, and finding out what's going to keep people around to go through your park. So this is the final design. It incorporates a lot of that stuff. It has, at the bottom, there's a timeline with a lot of local events and some national events, and still has the building of the mission, the Spanish period, the bear flag.
How large is this?
This is about almost 6 feet wide. And then we built the framework for it and installed it. And as soon as we did, it was just like a magnet for passersby, that they're just drawn there, and then that drew them further into the park. Strategically, it worked really well. Felt like it really went off of the interpretive plan from the beginning. And now I'll just show you a few different kinds of interpretive panels from my wandering and things I've seen online, whatever. This is one type that's really typical, a kiosk with a interpretive sign and some other information. This is the other extremely common type that you see around. These are called the high pressure laminate, the material that they make the panels out of, and they have metal bases and they're warranted to stand up to outdoor use for 10 years, including graffiti, teenagers, whatever. But they come in all shapes and sizes. Here's a custom one in a plaza. This one I like because it reflects the environment really well. It fits in well there, and I like the frame too there. This is a covered bridge in Oregon. This one I like because it's just an unusual visual for an interpretive panel. This was talking about a landslide, and as like big chunks of panel that kind of jumbled together. Kind of a nice way to carry that idea through. Right. Then this series is up in Lake Tahoe, the Taylor Creek area. Beautiful panels up there. This one's mounted to a rock, and the next one is on some bases that are brushed blue metal. It really reinforces the idea of water, which the panel was talking about. This is also, this whole series of Taylor Creek. This one is mounted to some trees in the creek bed. Next one is mounted to existing rock there. This one I like not only the reed frame that they came up with, but also it's like a big puzzle. It was talking about the watershed. It says stream, meadow, marsh. As you walk along the path, you come to the stream bed, and it talks about that part of the puzzle. And then this one is also talking about the water, and the base is made out of copper pipe. This one is a good example of how to take a lot of text about a whole bunch of different things and make it all work together. That's the most common problem I have is start off with too much text. This person, somehow they made it work. And this one's in Yosemite, talking about the geology and installed on a stone there. This one shows a tactile element for people with sight disabilities. It's of a waterfall in Yosemite, and they can at least get a sense of what the waterfall is like that way, because it's quite a hike from there. This is another in Yosemite, just a beautiful map that was illustrated. And nice supports on that one too. And this one is in a redwood grove, and it shows the signs on a form that is similar to the trees themselves, the color and shape. So that's another thing that I like to try to do is make things really fit in with their environment, because they're going to be there a long time and they're really part of the environment. So that's a few ideas on interpretive panels, and I think now we can open it up to questions for any of us. Yes?
There's a interpretive panel out the Rosita River Monument. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's in the shape of a victory ship, and then they have photographs that are displayed of the women who are there working, and like their photo IDs that go all along the waterfront. And my question is, what do you call that when you mount a photograph and you get super clarity from the photograph? What kind of interpretation do you call that?
You mean that as far as the material that is used to print it?
To put the photograph, to make it look like it's a real photograph mounted on metal. Is there a term for that?
I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I mean there are different materials that we use for printing, and one of the ones that's used really often is high pressure laminate. It's high resolution graphics that are printed on plastic, but it's really hard. It's like Formica. And then there are other materials too. There's porcelain, which is like a sink, but it also has really high resolution graphics.
I'm kind of curious of the process that you went through to arrive at a consensus for changing the logo for Old Sacramento.
So the issue with that is you have interpretation and you have branding. And the group that got together were the branding and marketing group that did this. I'm not exactly sure how they pushed this forward through the city, but I was struck with when he was showing Sonoma. Sonoma is a similar area. We have the buses and and all those things, the Sonoma State Park, but that is a state park. Imagine if you were then to say you had to interpret a quarter of a mile on each side and all the buildings, and you had to have a consensus, and you were going to give it a name. Who's in charge of that? And honestly, I don't know exactly who was in charge of that changeover, but it was more of a branding and not an interpretive. And this is where we're trying to get back to, wait a minute, you can't forget, this is a National Historic Landmark District, and we don't want to jeopardize that and lose that.
Just to follow up on that, tension between the interpretation and the marketing is very, very common. Palatable. Yes. When I worked in Oregon and was doing interpretation, we had a old gold rush town, and the marketing department wanted to market it as a ghost town and come see the ghosts and all of that, and that wasn't the stories that were relevant to the site. There was never any indication there were ghosts there. So, managing that tension between, advocating for tourism and development and marketing and being true to what the stories of your place are is something that will require ongoing dialogue and work.
Let me try to put this in the form of a question, and maybe this is directed more towards OSAC, but it seems to me that the future, that a lot of what I'm seeing seems static and will need to be changed. If you've got tourists that are coming in 5 years from now, are they looking at the same material? There's obviously expense from changing it. And so I don't understand why, and I'll use OSAC. New York has a project right now they're doing through the New York Public Library of landscape changing over time. So they'll take a street, say, but they'll show using some visual how it looks during different time periods, so that you get a sense of how that's changing. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, this seems now, what do you think the future of the trend's going to be towards exhibit planning once you have more interactive displays, multimedia? So I guess it's a future question.
Actually, from a museum standpoint, that is a very important question, is how are museums viewed today? And right now, museums, and this will make sense with Old Sacramento in a second, museums are places that are they're often viewed as temples. We have the stuff, you come to us. And what museums are realizing that they have to do is they have to break the walls and come out of it. And that's what we kind of see with Old Sacramento. There are so many different time frames of important things to talk about. So from a museum standpoint, we hope that we will be part of the conversation to see what the future of Old Sacramento is going to do to relate to that. What we do is with our historical reenactors and with the tours and those kinds of things, we try to take as much of our history aspect out to the streets and engage. Even there, though, there are two sides of interpretive reenactors. There is a side that wish to embody and just be the reenactor. You just, you may talk to me, but I am not going to necessarily engage you in some kind of interaction. Then there are those interpreters that are more wanting to play act. I want to talk to you, I want to tease with you, I want to be in my character, but I'm going to do things with you and put on little situational skits that would be relevant and stuff. So we're trying to bring more of that out to Old Sacramento, where the museum is the whole district. And that doesn't answer your question at all, but I love what you're talking about. Museums are struggling with how to make themselves relevant and how to bring the museum to the people and not the people to the museum.
We better wrap it up. Maybe one more quick question.
You come up with a theme now for a panel. Okay, how do you get a good panel with a good lifeline? In other words, what are you materials you're going to use? Different areas, different climate conditions.
Yeah.
And that's, you know.
There are different materials that I've worked with, and the high pressure laminate that I mentioned is the kind of the standard that the state parks, that's their default go-to material, and it's warranted to last for 10 years in any kind of weather conditions and anywhere in the country. But there's also porcelain, which may last longer, but it also can chip, and then there's another material that's fiberglass. It's also 10 years. So yeah, they all have their pluses and minuses, but those are the ones that the parks uses almost unilaterally. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, David and Delta and Kathy. That was, as David, as Kathy mentioned, one of the things that we will be embarking on over the next few years is an interpretive plan for the Delta, and so this will be one of the critical things that we'll be needing to work on. There will be interpretation that will be going on the local level and maybe on a single project level, but then there will also be the larger effort that we'll be doing on the National Heritage.